Thanks for joining, everybody. We're going to get started. And at the end of the presentation, we're going to do a Q&A. So we we try to let you guys actually take the stage to ask your questions. So when we get to that point, if you would like to basically be recorded in the webinar and ask your question live, that would be awesome. I would really appreciate it if we do it live. Otherwise, just type your question in and Megan will read it out and we'll do it by message like that. But I think it's really nice for everybody to hear from you directly and hear your voices, and especially as we have the recording and we publish it, it's always good for folks that watch it later to see that there's real people with real questions being asked. Excuse me. All right, so what we're talking about today is we're going to go over the usage of this is a bit of a dual presentation where we're going to talk a little bit about APIs and webhooks in general, just what they are, how they're used throughout different applications. And we're going to kind of use Monolith as an example of how to use APIs and webhooks and to try to build out different automation flows and that sort of thing. Obviously, because we run Monolith, but because we're familiar with Monolith, it's just a good platform to show as an example of how to use these different systems. So the first thing I'm going to do is just to make sure everybody is familiar with APIs and webhooks. I'm going to do just a brief discussion on both of those topics. So I'm going to share my screen here, and I'm going to pull up. This is just some whiteboarding software called Excalidraw. It's a really cool piece of software. So if you guys are doing presentations and you don't want to have to use something boring like a PowerPoint, use Excalidraw. It's really, especially in technical fields where you need to demonstrate something technical in nature, Excalidraw is really cool to use. So today we're talking about two things primarily. We have an API, which let me do this. We have an API, and then we have webhooks. Okay, so these are the two issues the two kind of things that we're talking about today. And what's the difference between these two? Well, APIs are specifically what we're going to be talking about are what's called RESTful APIs over HTTP. And so what these are really is, it's the way to think about it, it's an endpoint typically. So you'll have something like, for Monolith, for example, you'll have https://monolith.monolithforensics.com/API/v1/ and then you have resource, which identifies what type of data that you're accessing. So the way that these typically work with APIs is that you can make a GET or a POST request method to this endpoint, and this is going to just return a set of data to you. So typically the way this is used is either in basically an engineering space or programming space where you make an API call and you get something in return. Most web-based applications that you work with usually are using some implementation of this to make the application work. So specifically, if we hop into Monolith here, I can show you how our application uses this I'll load up Monolith. I'll go into DevTools here in Chrome. I'll click on the network tab. I'm going to switch the filter to fetch/XHR. And so I can do things like I can clear out this search. And so what you just saw was this query endpoint that popped up. And you can see this is an API call that the Monolith app is making. And you can see here the DevTools, here's our actual API REST endpoint that's being called. The method being used here is a POST. And if we inspect this in DevTools, we can actually see a preview, and we see there's this data object that gets returned. And we can see this list of data, which is effectively a list of our cases that you're seeing rendered here in the table. So even our application in Monolith is making use of APIs to basically send and receive data from the server that then gets loaded into the app if you guys are using Monolith, this is how Monolith data is actually being presented to you every time you navigate around the app. In our specific use case, Monolith is using JSON structured data to send data back and forth between the Monolith app and our server backend. Other different applications can use different types of data that's sent back and forth. JSON, which is JavaScript object notation, is a very common format that's used. Some apps use XML data. Some apps use more compressed binary data to send things back and forth. It just kind of depends on the application and how it's engineered. But this is effectively, because we're making use of this RESTful API, it allows us to construct an app like Monolith where we can efficiently send data back and forth between our server and between you on the client. And like I said, this is an example of our public API. So Monolith does have an API that if you're a Monolith customer, you can utilize our public API to do things like write Python scripts with it. You can integrate it with other systems. Basically, you can do whatever you want with it. But typically, you have this REST API and you have different methods that are used with these APIs. So these are what are called HTTP methods. So you typically have GET, you have POST, PUT, you have patch, and usually delete. And these are basically just semantic. Basically, it's a way to silo and categorize the types of requests that you're making. So we may have something like this endpoint here. Let's say our resource is actually we're going to work with our evidence API. Okay, so typically the way these HTTP methods work is if we make a GET request to this endpoint, Monolith is going to return. This is basically telling the Monolith server, hey, get me a list of evidence items. And so if you use the GET method, you're going to get to this endpoint, Monolith is going to send you a list of evidence items in your Monolith database. Post usually means you're going to post some data, meaning you're going to send some data to the server and you want the server to create a record for you. So with post, that means we're going to, if we use post with this evidence endpoint, same endpoint, just a different HTTP method, it's now going to expect you to send some data to the server so that the Monolith server can create an evidence record for you. And then we also have put and patch. Put and patch usually relate to some kind of update. So we typically use patch, and patch is where you would update, you might want to update details of an evidence item that already exists. So you might use a patch or put endpoint. These are usually interchangeable. They mean slightly different things, but they're more or less used interchangeably with each other. And this usually represents some kind of update that you're making to a record. And then you also have the delete method, which is an HTTP method, which is typically used to say, hey, I'm using this endpoint to delete a resource or delete a record. And the reason these are used is because it allows us to use this exact same endpoint here. We can use this exact same API endpoint, and all we have to do is change the method that we're using to dictate the different actions that we're trying to take on this particular resource. So the way to think about it is this API endpoint is being used to identify what data we want to do operations on. And then these methods identify the type of operation we want to conduct on this API. And that's what RESTful, that's when I say RESTful, that's what we're referring to is this sort of orientation here, this pattern of using get, post, put, patch, delete with a singular resource identified endpoint. That is what RESTful APIs are usually mean. And so that's how we designed our public API for Monolith customers is they can use our RESTful API that's structured with this pattern in mind to make it easy to understand and easy to use and implement. The other thing to keep in mind about this is this API is generally considered what we call a pull-based system. So what this means is that this is a system where to use our API, if you're using it, you have to always take some action to interact with it, meaning it doesn't do anything on its own. You just, if you're synchronizing data with our API, or if you are running some kind of process that utilizes our API, the system you have in place to utilize our API has to actively do things with our API. So for example, if you wanted to know every time a new case is created in Monolith and you wanted to use our API to do that, our API cannot just automatically on its own tell you whenever a new case is created. You would have to, on a regular schedule, make a GET request to the cases endpoint and basically do some kind of get that data returned to you and then run some kind of process to figure out if any new cases have been created in the last 24 hours or something like that. So you're having to constantly do some kind of, sometimes this is also called a polling method, which means on a regular basis, you're basically polling this endpoint and then you're checking for some kind of delta, or you're checking for new case records or checking for updated case records, that sort of thing. So in some systems, in order to continually get updated information to synchronize it with something like Monolith, you have to do some kind of scheduled polling or scheduled pull to pull in all the data, do a review of it, check for new records or updated records, and then do whatever process you want to do. Okay. And so to demonstrate this, I'll show you a very simple implementation of this in Python. Let me switch over to my Python system here. So what we have here is I have a very, very simple Python script that utilizes our API. So you can see here's that endpoint. Okay, that same API v1 evidence. This is our evidence endpoint. So if I want to make a GET request to this and just get a list of evidence items, I can do that. I can do this request in Python syntax. We have this request library that just makes HTTP requests for us. And what I'm doing here is I'm just saying request.get, and then I'm putting in this URL, this API endpoint. And this Python script is going to make an HTTP GET request to that endpoint, and it's going to return a data set to us. So what I'm going to try to do here is see if I can modify this and quickly add a, so what I'll do here is this is evidence. So I'll do evidence, response.json, import JSON, indent 4, so we get a nice clean output. So what I'll do is I'll run this, and also the way that our HTTP system works is we use an API key. And I've got an API key that's loaded into an environment variable, so I don't have to actually share the key itself. But what this script is going to do is it's going to pull in our API key from an environment variable and load that into our headers. And we use this X API key custom header to place the API key, and that's how you authenticate on our APIs, through the use of API keys, which you can issue yourself in Monolith, and I'll show how that works in a second. But basically what I want to demonstrate here is that just in a few lines of code in Python, we can make a REST-based HTTP call and get evidence data. So what I'm going to do here in my terminal here at the bottom, I'm going to run python3 main.py. It's going to run the script. And what it's going to do is then create this JSON file that has a list of evidence items. So I can scroll through this and I can just see, I think it's paginated also. So our API is paginated. So I think it pulls by default about 1,000 records at a time. And so if I close out this data object here, which has a list of all of our actual evidence records, and they're split up into different JSON objects here. So we've got an array of objects where we have an array of evidence items. I can collapse this data object, and what you'll see here is that we have pagination metadata here that kind of tells us how this data is organized. So we have a page size of 1,000. So that means this first API call only has 1,000 records in it. It's telling us that we're on the first page. The next page is page number 2. There's 18 total pages, and there's 17,142 total records. So what that means is that if we wanted to pull all of the evidence records, we would have to iterate through each individual page to get all 18 pages worth of records to make sure we get all the evidence items. But just on one simple API call, we are getting just 1,000 of the first 1,000 evidence records that are in our Monolith database. Now, on top of that, we also have, there's additional, so let's say you don't want to just get a raw list of evidence items. We can also get, we can pass in what are called parameters to get certain, to get specific records. So I could, for example, I can add a case ID parameter. Let's say case ID equals 1. And we can run this and then get a different set of records. So this time, now we've only got 187 evidence items that were returned, because in our API, I put in this query parameter that says, hey, only give me the list of evidence items for case ID number 1. So now we're saying only give me evidence for a very specific monolith case. And I'm demonstrating this just to say that with RESTful APIs, this is how filtering works at a programmatic level. You pass in, and our monolith documentation reveals all the different parameters that we have available here so that you can get filtered data sets through this API. Okay. And so here we can see, like, if we look at each one of these, we can see things like the associated case will be case number 1, if I can find it in this data here. Case UUID. Where is the case ID? There it is. Okay, case ID number 1. And so if I do a quick search for this, you'll see we got that is listed 187 times, which makes sense because we only have 187 evidence items in this list that we pulled. Okay. So that's the programmatic way of using this. If you're a Python scripter, this is great. If you have other business applications or applications in your environment or organization, a lot of applications have built-in systems that allow you to just make API calls for integration purposes and that sort of thing. So I'm going to leave it there for just the brief explanation of how APIs work. And then what we're going to do is talk about webhooks for a second. And let me switch back over to my Excalidraw. So now if we go back to the system here, now if we talk about webhooks, webhooks are similar to APIs in that they use kind of the same HTTP architecture. The main difference, though, is that webhooks are more of a push system instead of a pull or a polling system. So the way webhooks work is, instead of, if you wanted to run a process every time a new case is created, instead of having to pull the cases API and listing all the cases and looking for new cases that have been created or cases that have been updated, you can use a webhook that will basically fire off an event every time a case is created or updated. So that way you don't have to actually pull or do a scheduled task or something to pull those APIs. You can just wait for a webhook to get fired to your system of choice, and then it will automatically, you just sit and listen and wait for those changes to come in. So same thing. Usually the way a webhook works is you provide the webhook with a webhook URL, which is basically, this is external systems URL that will listen for webhook events. And then you need to parse the webhook event data when it comes in. And then you would execute some action once that data is parsed. Okay. So this one's a little bit more complicated because now, in order for webhooks to work, you need another, let's say you're using webhooks in Monolith. That means you need some other third-party system that's capable of consuming a webhook event, and then it can parse the webhook event that we send, and then take some action. So to demonstrate this, I'm going to pull up something called Zapier. So Zapier, if you've never heard of it, is it's something I'm a big fan of. We use it here at Monolith for various internal business operations and integrations. But Zapier is basically a system that it's an online system that what they do is they compile a list of all these different applications that exist, and they do the hard work of building out all the APIs for all these different systems and giving you a nice point and click interface to integrate different systems together at a customized level. So in this situation, let's say that I want to set up a webhook in Monolith. So I'll go to settings, I'll go to APIs here, and let's say I'll create a new webhook. I'm going to turn off my previous ones just to make sure there's no cross interference here. And I'll just say Workshop Wednesdays demo webhook to Zapier. Okay. So if you'll see when I'm creating a new webhook in Monolith, a couple of things that it's asking me for is just a name, just so we can name it so we know what the webhook is. And the most important part here is this webhook URL. So this is where we need to tell Monolith, great, I want you to set up a webhook, and this is where I want you to send webhook events. So in this case, I'm going to go to Zapier because I want to set up a webhook listener. So I'm going to click on, and the way Zapier works is you start a new Zap, and it always starts with a trigger, something that kicks off this series of actions or automations. And for this trigger, I'm going to select webhooks. And when I trigger an event, I'm going to say catch raw hook. Okay. And what this is going to do is Zapier is going to set up a webhook URL for me. And it's got this, this sort of HTTP string here, this URL string that I can then copy. I could go back into Monolith. I could paste this into our webhook URL. And I'll just enter some kind of description for us. This is a test webhook. And down here, what you'll see, we'll ignore the signing secret in a moment. I can explain that later, but it's not important for this demonstration. But what I can do here is I can set up the webhook events that I want to be active for this. So I can, for example, if I turn on cases, then what's going to happen is this webhook is going to fire anytime I create, update, or delete a case. If I also select evidence, that means this webhook is going to fire anytime I create, update, or delete an evidence item. So I'm going to just keep it to evidence for now, just to keep it simple. And I'm going to go ahead and create this webhook. And so now the webhook is created. And what's going to happen is every time I make a change or do something with an evidence record, Monolith is going to send a webhook with some event payload to this Zapier URL. And then Zapier is listening and waiting for that webhook to come in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click test trigger. And so what I need to do now in order to test this is I need to actually make sure this webhook actually fires. And the quickest way to do that is I'm just going to go update a random piece of evidence. So I'm going to go to evidence here, and I'm just going to update this, and I'm going to assign this evidence item to myself. Okay. Now by assigning I just changed this evidence record. It should now fire an update-based webhook event, and Zapier should capture it. So I'm going to test this trigger. And so now you can see that it found a new record that was pulled on February 25th, 2026. And so I can look at this record and I can see the payload. Now this is kind of hard to read, but as soon as I made that update, Monolith fired that webhook and it sent it to Zapier, and Zapier just accepted it. It received that webhook. And you can see this evidence number, CFM 2514. 25, and here's the evidence item 2514. So I can continue with this selected test record, and now I can do something else. So let's say we can do, and now what I get to decide is, okay, great, we've got the trigger set up. Now what do I want to do for an action? And you can see here, it just has some applications here that we can use automatically. So it just depends. And Google, Zapier has all these different applications that we can hook into for different things. So it's got all of our Google apps. It has like Microsoft Excel. It has Slack. It has Gmail, Google Sheets. So let's do Google Sheets here. And what I'm going to do is I'll create a new Google Sheets system here. And I'm going to call this, just call this webhook test. Now I'm doing this kind of off the cuff, so I'm not entirely sure if this is going to work perfectly or not, but we're going to try. We're going to see if we can get it to work here. Action events, we're going to say create spreadsheet row. That's what I want to do. And then account, I'm going to select my account. And so this is where you're also, okay, I'll reconnect our account here just so it has access. So what I'm effectively doing is I'm telling Zapier, I've got my Google account hooked into Zapier, and it's going to use Google's API to create a spreadsheet row in some spreadsheet. So I'm going to do this, and I'm going to select, okay, I don't care about that. What I do care about is, let's say webhook. So here's my webhook test spreadsheet. Okay. And then worksheet, I'm just going to select the default. Give it a second here, sheet one. So if you'll notice, I've got my Google spreadsheet here, and I've got just sheet one as the worksheet. And so webhook test, sheet one. If we go to Zapier, we can see spreadsheet, webhook test, sheet one. And so we now have Zapier pointed at the spreadsheet that we want to use. And then here we can say, let's see, send rows to Google Sheets. So let's test and see how it works. Okay, and then if we check our spreadsheet here, okay, I don't see anything. I probably haven't inserted any data yet. Data in. Figure. Let's see here. Okay, so it's not giving me the, so normally what it would do is it would give me the data from the webhook here, but I'm not seeing it. So anyway, the point is what's supposed to happen is the webhook would send, if you look at this raw data here from this record, it would forward this record data to the next action, and then we're able to draw from this record to put data into it. So from here, what should be able to happen is on the configure step, we should be able to access the data from the webhook and then insert that data into the spreadsheet. But it looks like it's not. So I probably should have tested this before, but let's try a different step here. Let's try Gmail. And let's say send an email to events account, connect my Gmail account to this. I'll just send this to myself. And then from name, that's fine. Subject. Okay, so now we have access to our raw data here. So subject, I'm just going to say evidence webhook. And then body type plain. And then here in the body, we can do things like, I'm just going to put the raw. I could put in more formatted information by selectively entering like different details here from the webhook. But what I'm going to do instead is I'm just going to put the raw output here. Actually, I'll do the raw body just so that we have it here. Okay, and then I'll click continue. And then I'll test that step just to make sure it works. And I'm going to check my email really quick to see if I got it. And I'll share this so you can see what this looks like. So it's pretty ugly, but I'm just doing this again for a demonstration. So this is what the email looks like. So we set up this webhook. So what'll happen is every time I make a change to evidence records in Monolith, if I create an evidence item, if I delete an evidence item, if I update an evidence item, I'm going to receive an email that has data that looks like this. Now, this isn't pretty, but again, I'm just doing this to demonstrate how it works. Where the point is is with webhooks, you can basically set up automations where anytime a change occurs to specified resource, whether it's a case or evidence item, you can then have it conduct some kind of action. In this case, I'm telling it to create an email and send it to myself. And the way this works in Zapier is once I have this published and set up, I can then continue. I can continue here. I'll remove this one because it's not working the way I want. And I can just publish this. And now that it's published, what will happen now is anytime I make a change, again, to an evidence item like this, so I change the priority to urgent, I am now going to get an email that that tells me that that change was made. So the point of this is here, I'm just doing something fairly dumb, just sending an email with some raw data in it. But the point is you can set up in something like Zapier, you can set up these automations with just about any service that you want. You can hook it into some kind of AI system where you can parse that data and summarize. So for example, I can insert an AI action here where it can summarize the data here. And let's see if we can. Okay, let's see here. What I want is this. Save. And then I can generate a preview again. And so what I'm doing here is in Zapier, I'm just testing this right here. So here we get an email. It's taking that data from the webhook and using AI to just parse some kind of summary for us. So now I can finish this. I can continue here. And on our raw body here, instead of putting the raw body, I'm going to put the output of the data that was returned. Here. Well, let's do that. I'm just going to add all this stuff here. Oops. So this isn't probably going to be in a good order, but I'm just trying to do this quickly to show how it works. And so again, I've got now a new email that has a little bit more, it looks a little bit cleaner than that object body. So now I'm going to get an email that looks more like this, where we make an update or we create an evidence item or we delete an evidence item. Now what I'm going to get is an email that gives me a summary of what those changes are and what the item is. And you can basically play around with this. I'm doing this like quick and dirty, so you can add more formatting to this. You don't have to use AI. You can also just manually format it exactly the way you want so you get the same thing every time. Or you can pass it in that Zapier step. You can pass that raw data to the AI, give it a prompt, and it will basically give you a summary of the data or do something else with the data for you so that you get this sort of nice summary. And this, again, this is a crude example, but this is an example where all we're doing is we are just catching anytime anytime an update happens. If we look at our integration here, we're catching evidence webhooks in Zapier. We're sending the webhook event to AI to basically summarize what's going on with that event. And then we're sending a notification email every time it changes. So this is a very simple workflow, but you can then, in something like Zapier, again, you can continue just adding on top of this. You can add any other integrations or actions that you want. There's all kinds of stuff that you can bake into it, like you can build in parsers and all kinds of really crazy logic that you can do inside of Zapier. And the reason I'm pointing to Zapier is it just makes it to where if you're not a programmer, if you don't know how to write, if you're not strong in writing code or don't have a lot of experience with it, well, a system like Zapier helps you build these automations without having to know a whole lot about code. Because the whole point is Zapier has done the hard work for you and built out all these different APIs so they can immediately connect to each other. And in this situation, we're just using webhooks, but we could also hook in Monolith APIs into this as well. So we can also hook our Monolith API into the Zapier system to do other things. And Zapier is just one example of this. There's other systems out there that do things similarly. You can also have some of your organizations have more complex business applications that have some of this stuff built right into it, that you can just use Monolith's API and webhooks to just connect some other organizational application to Monolith so that when things are happening in Monolith, data is automatically being sent to those other applications. And again, we're also using Monolith as a reference here, but a lot of applications have a similar setup to Monolith where they have APIs and webhooks on themselves that can do exactly these same things. So it's not just, this isn't something specific to Monolith. This is just something that Monolith has as a feature set. But it's a very common integration framework that a lot of more mature applications use. So if you're creative, based on what I've just demonstrated, I've shown you like the basics of, okay, here's how you can interact with this API using Python. Here's how you can interact with this API and webhooks using something low code like Zapier. And then you have other systems that may have baked in webhook consumption feature sets or their own API systems that you can just integrate directly with another application. But this is a setup where theoretically, if you wanted, let's say every time a new case is created, you want it to kick off some other workflow, or if you want Model to be able to notify a specific department or division or set of people, you could set up something like this where someone gets notified every time a case is created. Or you can even be more complex with it and say, oh, I don't want this action to run every time a case is created, but I do want it to run every time a specific type of case is created. And that's where, when you catch this webhook, you can add another action called something like paths or formatter or filter, where you can basically check that event data and add some kind of condition. So like I can add a condition here where then it's going to split this into different, to basically take different actions. So for example, I can say only continue if and this is probably, let me change this to, instead of catch raw hook, let's try that instead. Okay, well, that's probably not going to work. Anyway, I'll probably have to add some kind of formatter here. So let's try this. Transform. Anyway, I'm kind of getting in the weeds here, but you get the idea. We can do all these different things to kind of handle these webhooks and do different things with them to set up triggers and do some pretty complex stuff. And what I like about Zapier for this is you can do this without really writing any code, which is really nice. Otherwise, without something like Zapier, you'd have to be very comfortable with something like Python or something like that. So that's pretty much it. That's what I kind of wanted to cover. This one's a pretty simple one. It's really just to cover both the use cases for both APIs and webhooks to automate things. If in your forensics lab or your team, if you already have some kind of automation workflow set up, this is basically, if you're not aware of APIs or webhooks, again, this isn't unique to Monolith. This is something that a lot of mature applications have. We're just using Monolith as an example. But this is something that's a very, very powerful utility where you can use these APIs and webhooks together to set off automations or set up different workflows. If you work in a large organization or if you work in a large team, this can help automate and streamline some processes that you may have that are manual right now, especially when it comes to closing cases or completing evidence items or completing tasks, things like that, where under certain conditions, you want some work to be automated so that you don't have to manually do it every time. This can also be really useful if you want like custom reports to be pulled out of Monolith. If you have a very specific set of reports or details, you can utilize our API to basically construct your own reports, because what the API does, it just gives you raw access to the data that you have in your Monolith database. instead of relying purely on whatever features we build in Monolith, you can use our API to build out your own reports, your own features, your own. You could do whatever you want with it, basically, and that's kind of the whole point. So I'll pause there and just kind of open the floor for any questions or thoughts or ideas, and see if anybody has anything they want to contribute.
Great, cool. If you have any questions or you have an idea you want to contribute, if you want to bring talk about that on microphone, if you go ahead and raise your hand, I'll give you access to talk, and you can ask those questions live. Or if you prefer, go ahead and type your questions in the chat, and we'll get them answered for you. I'm also going to paste the link in our docs for the API information in case anybody here is a Monolith user. If you weren't aware that we have all this documentation for how to set up APIs inside of Monolith, I'm going to paste that link in the chat as well.
That's right. It's a good call. I forgot to. I'll share my screen just to give a preview of that really quick. In case. So our docs page is just docs.monolithforensics.com. We have a whole section here just on APIs and how they work and how the authentication works and how to utilize our API and everything. So if you're interested in seeing that, just venture over to our docs page and you can see how our API is currently documented and how to interact with it.
Alrighty. Don't see any questions coming in.
Okay. I think I stunned everybody into silence.
Oh, somebody raised their question. All right. Hang on, Gabriela, let me give you access to talk. Alrighty, allow to talk. All right.
Hello?
Hello.
Hello. Welcome, Gabriela.
Hey.
Hi.
Hey, Gabby.
Hi, this is my first meeting with you guys for the workshop, and I'm just wondering, I thought this was really cool. How often do you guys do these? And do you only send out the invites via emails? Because that's how I found this one.
Yeah, we do the. Oh, sorry, Megan, go ahead. You run the show here, so go ahead.
Yeah, so we normally post about it on our LinkedIn page. So if you give us a follow there, that's a good way to find it. And then we do usually include it in our Monolith newsletter if we have one coming up, and then we'll send an email out either the week before or the day before. We're working on finding a permanent place to link to put it on our website, just so it's accessible there as soon as we have one, a new one to register for. But also since we do these every 2 weeks, if you don't come across the link, if you just email marketing@monolithforensics.com, I'm happy to send over whatever the next registration link is for you directly.
Perfect. Thank you, guys.
Yep. And
Thank
just
you.
to summarize too, Ella, we do these every 2 weeks on Wednesday. And we do different types. This week was more monolith heavy, but usually we're trying to do more agnostic forensic stuff. And I think like next month I have someone coming in to do a presentation on doing defense work in forensics. So someone from New York is going to talk about. They primarily do defense work, so that should be pretty interesting. And so throughout the year, I'm trying to actually get people from the industry to come on and do presentations as well, so it's not just me you're hearing from. But and then we also publish these. For the first few weeks, they're only available. The video is only available to attendees, but after 3 or 4 weeks, we then publish it to our YouTube channel also. So if you go to our YouTube channel, you'll actually see. I know we've got at least one published. We might have two published by now that you can actually watch the previous webinars that we've done.
Cool. What is that YouTube link you said?
Yeah, if you just go to YouTube and Google Monolith Forensics, it's
Okay.
pretty easy to find.
Gotcha. Cool.
And we're putting all the webinar recordings into a playlist called webinars. So if you don't see it populating on top and just here's the newest videos, you'll be able to find the webinars there every time we post them publicly. I'm gonna go ahead and Joey has, I think, already beat me to it.
Yeah.
I was gonna
what's
post our
great too
YouTube channel,
is
Joey on it. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and also too, some of these workshops, I actually put together notes and demonstratives together, and we link those into the YouTube channel as well, so that when you see me doing a presentation, I have notes or documents or something I put together. You can, in the YouTube description, there's a link to a Google Drive folder that will have like those same items so that you guys can get copies of any notes or anything I put together. So that way you guys don't have to worry about like screen capturing or anything like that, and just literally get a copy of the stuff that I put together for each presentation. This one didn't have anything because it was just all based on our API, which is documented publicly. But once I do more in-depth workshop stuff, I usually have notes that are provided.
All right, cool. Thanks for
Very
these
cool. Thank you,
questions.
guys.
Thank you. Thanks for coming
Yep,
today.
no, yep.
We have another raised hand from Gary, so I'm gonna go ahead and give Gary permission to talk as well. Oh, where'd it go? Gary. Gary, I saw you raise your hand. I'm gonna give you permissions to talk if you still have a question.
Hey, Gary. Hey, Gary. We can hear you.
Thanks for that demo. It's really interesting. I was wondering, could you combine the Monolith API with Monolith Webhooks to create automations within Monolith itself? So if an action is performed in one part of the application, another part can be updated.
Yep, absolutely. And that's a great, again, that's a great use case for Zapier, where you could literally listen for a webhook in Zapier. And let's say that every time an evidence item is updated, or every time a case is updated based on whatever is changed, I want it to update something else in Monolith. You could listen to a webhook, and then where the trigger is the webhook, and then the actions are Monolith's API, where you do different Monolith API things, and you can trigger several Monolith API actions in a row. And in you can actually do some really crazy logic in Zapier where you can set up conditions and filters and all kinds of stuff to do different things. And I like Zapier just because it like I said, it's up to a certain point, it's free, and then they'll start making you pay for it, but it's relatively cheap. But I like it because if you're not, the main reason I really like it is because otherwise, if you don't have something like Zapier to do these automations, you have to set up your own server somewhere where it has to be available to listen to these different events that are triggering it. And then on top of that, you have to be familiar with Python to write all Python, which some of you guys are super familiar with this stuff, so you're able to do it. But most people just don't have the time or the skill to like sort of build out their own automation server and everything. And Zapier kind of fills in that gap for you. But absolutely, you can do that. You can basically chain Monolith webhooks down to Monolith API calls based on different conditions that you want to have in place.
Okay, great. And for Zapier, is there like an enterprise, or like is it basically secure to use with client data?
Yeah, Zapier is a very common, like it's probably I think it's the top of the list in terms of these types of, there's a few different platforms like this, but Zapier is the most well known. I consider it extremely secure, extremely reliable. They do have enterprise plans and things like that you can hook into for this. And actually, when we work with our customers, especially in the private sector, Zapier is something I pretty much mention in every customer call or demo that we have, because it's and we use it ourselves internally for lots of business stuff. Like we have automations set up with our sales team. We have automations set up for Megan and our marketing team so that it helps us just automate a lot of different business pipelines that we have. Otherwise, all of our people would be doing a bunch of manual data entry and a bunch of manual repetitive work. So outside of just forensics, we're using Zapier ourselves as a company to help us manage different business automations. So I highly recommend it. I trust them ourselves, and I recommend them all the time to different customers.
Got it. Okay, great. Thanks, Matt.
Thanks. No, thanks for coming. Thanks for asking.
Alrighty. Anybody else got a question? Maybe. All right. I think that's it for questions now.
Awesome. Well, thanks everybody. We appreciate it. Just to end cap this, obviously I'm sometimes a bad salesman for our products, but I'll end cap it with, if you're not I think a lot of you guys are already Monolith customers. For those of you that aren't Monolith customers, if you're interested in taking a look, you can hop onto our website. Obviously, feel free to reach out to us via our contact form, or you can just email us directly. My email is just matt@monolithforensics.com. If you're interested in taking a look or taking Monolith for a test spin, just to try it out, just reach out to us. We'll get you a demo. We'll get you a trial where you get full access to the software, and we'll give you a chance to play around with it. But otherwise, thanks everybody for joining. Please join us for next webinars. We're going to be doing this throughout the year. I'm trying real hard to get some other people in here, so it's not just me you're hearing from every 2 weeks. I've got a couple of folks lined up throughout the year, including a person that does digital forensics in the defense realm. I've got another person to come in to talk about cloud storage, and then I think later in the year I'm going to have an actual litigator that I've worked with to come in to talk about, what it's like to work with digital forensics experts, what they kind of expect to see, what they like about forensic experts, what they don't like, how they like to utilize them. So I think we'll have some pretty good presenters throughout the year that'll be interesting. So I'll end it on that. Thanks to everybody for coming, and let us know if we can do anything for you.
Thanks, guys.
All right.